Okay, I think we'll begin. So welcome everybody to today's iKids seminar, which is titled Research in Climate Change and Development from the Bottom Up, Reflections from Current Practice. My name's Susan Newman. I'm Professor of Economics here at the Open University and involved in the organisation of this seminar series. Before I hand over to Arabella to introduce the roundtable and the other speakers, I just have a few bits of housekeeping to run over. The first is that the seminar is being recorded and the recording will be posted on the Open University YouTube channel. So if you wish to remain anonymous, do just keep your camera off. After all the speakers have presented their initial contributions, we will open up the virtual floor for questions and contributions. At this point, please do use the raise hand function to indicate if you would like to speak, and we will call you in. You're also welcome to stick your question or comment in the chat. But again, if you wish to remain anonymous in the recording, when you do post a question in the chat, please just ask not to be named and we'll read out the question on your behalf. To find out more about the work of iKid and other seminars, you can follow us on our various social media handles, which I think Craig is going to stick into the chat box for everyone to see. So today's seminar, Researching Climate Change and Development from the Bottom Up, Reflections from Current Practice, has been put together by Arabella Fraser, together with many other collaborators in the field around the world. Arabella is a senior lecturer in global development here at the Open University. Her research focuses on the social and political implications of climate and disaster risk for urban development and development practice. So without further ado, I'm just going to hand over to Ari to introduce the panel and each of the speakers before beginning. So I'll hand that over to you. Thank you, Ari, and thanks all for your contributions.
Thanks, Susan, and welcome to everyone from Patch Room in Milton Keynes. Hopefully you can see and hear me okay. There is a kind of roving camera here that's focusing on different members of the audience here in Milton Keynes. The idea for this seminar was to focus one of our international development series on the issue of climate change, but also to bring together a network of practitioners and academics to really discuss the role of community-led research and its place in climate change research and how we actually achieve impact from the bottom up across very different kind of political and social contexts across global north and global south. And some of the projects we're going to talk about today are about that cross-learning, in particular project we've had funded by the Open University Open Societal Challenges Fund, which has been working with both the UK and Kenya. So we're going to hear from both contexts. The format for today is we're going to have 4 presentations, and then I'm going to pass to 2 colleagues, Moses, who's very kindly joined us early in the morning from Canada, and Les, who's here with me to give some reflections from their kind of current research work and practice, and then open up to a Q&A. So hopefully do feel you don't have to just ask questions. The idea was to have a kind of exchange and interchange from all sorts of people kind of doing research on communities, led by communities in all sorts of ways, and to explore what that means for research in climate change and development going forward. But our first speakers are Sarah and Jacob, who've joined us from Nairobi, where Sarah works at Shack Dwellers International as the Youth Engagement and Communications Manager. She works closely with young people across the informal settlements in Nairobi to translate community-led data and research into accessible, impactful narratives. She's pursuing a PhD in information and communication as well at the University of Nairobi. And Sarah and I have worked together, I think, since a project we had during the pandemic, which was about supporting young people's voices in pandemic response. And this year we were able to revisit some of the findings from that research through Open University funding to kind of re-explore young people's perspectives on that data and on urban crisis and what that means to them. So Sarah and Jacob, over to you.
Hi, Ari. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us, and I hope you're able to hear us. Can you hear us?
We
Okay,
hear
thank
you
you
well.
very
Yeah,
much.
absolutely fine.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Ari. Just as Ari has said, my name is Sarah Uma. I work for SDA Kenya. SDA Kenya supports Muungano na Vijiji. It's a local NGO here in here in Nairobi that is affiliated to Slum Dwellers International Secretariat Network, which we have different affiliate countries, over 20 affiliate countries, and we are one of them. And it was a really good experience to work with you, Ari, and especially to work with the young people and just to revisit the project and have the youth validate and raise some of the concerns they have, some of the aspirations they have to be co-designers, to like go beyond being data collectors, to be part of analysis, to be part of creating the evidence, to be able to use the data for advocacy. It really was such an amazing experience. I'll pass it on to Jacob to also just sort of tell us a little bit about Muungano, just as I have only briefly touched on SDA Kenya and our role in supporting Muungano and Vijiji. So Jacob will come in and talk about Muungano.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the opportunity and nice to meeting you, all of you. Yeah, my name is Jacob Umundi. I'm a youth coordinator from Madare representing Muungano na Vijiji. Muungano na Vijiji is a federation of people living in the informal settlement advocating for land, housing and services. So far so good. Muungano na Vijiji, we are currently celebrating 30 years of existence. So as we are celebrating 30 years of existence, what kind of information are we trying to pass out there? What has been our main impact, especially when it comes to the use of data? So I think the having this meeting came at the right time, where we'll also be talking about some of the engagement that we've been having for the past 30 years based on the data processes that we've been having, especially with the community. And I being part of the community members, at least it also gives an opportunity to like give the real impact and maybe the lived experience based on the kind of work SDI Kenya has been supporting Muungano na Vijiji as a federation of slum residents. Yeah, and I think so far so good. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, we have a PowerPoint presentation, but I'm having challenges putting it on. Craig, if you're in the call, are you able to help us?
Sorry, Sarah, what's the issue with the sharing? You have permissions.
Okay.
I would offer to jump in, but when I tried to share slides earlier, my laptop crashed.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
No worries. But as I sort out the the PowerPoint issue, Jacob can just come in and tell us just tell us who Muungano is, like how we work together, Muungano and SDA Kenya. I had mentioned earlier that SDA Kenya gives technical support to Muungano. Muungano, by the way, is the largest national movement of slum dwellers and urban poor people in Kenya. And it's been in existence since 1996. And just like Jacob said, we are celebrating 30 years of making slums visible. We share the same vision. We believe in inclusive cities. We believe that the urban poor and slum dwellers should have access to land, housing, and services. And we are, as an organization, we exist to support Muungano. So Jacob will come in and speak about the model of Muungano before we proceed to go in and tell you guys how community-led data has been the backbone of Muungano and SDA Kenya since 1996, how we've used it as a tool for advocacy, for negotiation, how we have engaged communities, and why it's very critical for us and some of those successes. So Jacob will come in and speak about that as I sort out the PowerPoint issue. Thank you.
Yeah, so far so good. I think for Muungano na Vijiji, one, I think especially when it comes to formation of movements, I think for the formation of movement, sustaining a movement for more than 30 years has never been easy. And bearing the fact that I also came in and found that, okay, there's a movement called Muungano na Vijiji. So I think for me, what made me more interested in working very closely with Muungano na Vijiji, Muungano na Vijiji, was in terms of the process, the way they engage community. How do we ensure that the participation is more inclusive and sustaining, especially when it comes to even the kind of data we are collecting. So I think that was the drive as to why I joined Muungano. Then another thing, movements have been formed in Kenya, but we end up like a lot of movement don't even finish more than 30 years. So I think for Muungano, what has made us stood out for that 30 years is because we have structures. So we have the Muungano and Vijiji Federation, which has leadership. We call them the national coordinators. So for the national coordinators, they are across the country. So the national coordinators normally ensure that at least we have a proper coordination at the settlement level, especially when it comes to community organizing and movement building along the way. Then another thing about the federation's role is to like strengthen local partnership within the informal settlement, ensure that as much as we are taking this data, is there uptake for this data? Is there somebody that can also like ensure that we push for change and also in terms of action and advocacy oriented? Yeah, so I don't think, Sarah, are you ready?
Not yet. I'm still having trouble with the PowerPoint presentation, but I think we could.
Yeah. Okay. I think we can just go through the slide that we were having. Yeah. So one of the strategies that we've been using as Muungano and Vijiji was when it comes to community development in practice. One, we've been using savings as a means of bringing people together, because we normally encourage people to be in a group, so that we believe that if people are many in a group, it's easy for them to like solve complex problem rather than moving like as a unit, moving like as a unit. So I think one of the things we've seen an opportunity of like ensuring that we focus on savings. We also focus on community-led data process. What do we say? What do I mean when we say community-led data process? We believe that community themselves are part and parcel of the all data collection processes, from identifying priority needs to data collection, from the data collection to analysis, and also even giving the outcome. So the process itself is also being supported by the SDI Kenya. So SDI Kenya comes in when it comes to data to offer technical support when it comes to like supporting the analysis project, the analysis processes, ensuring that everything is in order. And apart from that, we've also used peer-to-peer learning as an opportunity for people to learn, like in terms of how do you ensure that young people learn. So we normally subject them to exchange. So to exchange, like both the exchange are more local at the community level. We have national exchanges and also international exchanges that normally come once at a time. So that is one of the way that we normally ensure that as much as community members get this information, they can easily share amongst themselves and also learn. Another thing is the collective voice and negotiation. So for the collective voice and negotiation, we are looking up to, as much as we are carrying out this data. So how do we bring the community stakeholders on board? How do we bring the government on board? Because for us, we believe that we cannot work in silo. We have to work with the government. So one of the way of working with the government is that we ensure that they're also part and parcel of the planning process, especially when we are conducting our activities. We have to inform the local authorities about our engagement, so that they can also buy in our idea and also see how do we come in to like support communities when it comes to generating data. Next slide, please. So there's this quote there's this powerful quote from one Rhoda Otieno. She's one of the community leader, Muungano community leader. She's also a national federation leader. So she was talking about organizations come here, they collect our data and then they leave. People from the community get tired. We don't even know what the information is used for. So I think for her, she was feeling like, okay, as much as we are collecting data within the informal settlement, how do we ensure that the data sovereignty remains with the community members? How do we ensure that community members how do we ensure that community members also own these data processes? How do we ensure that community members are owning these data processes? Because we've been having a lot of data collection within the informal settlement, but majority of this data being collected, you'll find that some of them, they don't go back to the community. But for us as a movement, we normally push SDI Kenya to like focus on bringing back the data through the validation process so that the community can now start the engagement. Another way that we've adopted a new way of engaging young people, especially when it comes to data, like as you can see from the presentation, we are now using the drone mapping, more drone mapping and GIS technology to like digitize our data, because the world is also going AI. So how do we build on AI and also on technology when it comes to the way we collect our data? So I think that is one of the way that we've been. That is one of the new skills that young people have developed over the uh, ago. Then what do we mean when we say meaningful participation? We mean inclusive design. How do you ensure that community members are part and parcel of the co-creation session where we ensure that community members are engaged before, during, and after the data collection, so that we can ensure that as much as this data we've collected, it can also be incorporated in the annual development plans with the annual development plans that is normally provided by the county government. And another thing is that as much as we are collecting this data, so how do we ensure that priorities are given to what community wants, not what we want? Because you'll find majority of the data projects have been donor oriented, but we forget about the community priorities. So how do we shift our focus to like focus on more on community priorities rather than donor oriented priorities? Because if we focus on community priorities, it's easy for even the community to feel the ownership of the data itself, and also it's easy for the community to also engage with the data, because the feeling is about what they feel, what they see, what they understand. Another way we've been using enumeration mapping and community enumeration and mapping as a way of also ensuring that community members we get like enough information about the community. So far I can talk about the enumeration strategy that we did in Madare 4B. We did like a whole village 100% settlement profiling, where we were trying to understand the number of households, understanding the level of income within the informal settlement when it comes to access to services like social services, like access to education, access to healthcare facilities. Is there availability, access to sanitation? So for the profiling itself was just trying to give us an information about what Madare entails and how do we want to achieve this. So this one was also a strategy of us like ensuring that community members are also part and parcel. Then along this, we also build capacity for young people, because as much as young people are participating in this, they gain skills around data collection, drone mapping, and these skills they can at least easily gain livelihood opportunities and also like improve their income, because we are seeing in Kenya, majority of the population is young people. So how do we shift our focus in supporting young people? So we focus on that. Then we have the Know Your City television, which is the global collective of young people from informal settlement, dedicating and creating media as a tool, dedicating and creating media as a tool for advocacy. So when it comes to data collection, what we've been doing so far is that we bridge in what we've been doing so far is that we bridge in the data to publication. So how do we ensure that the data that we collect is also backing up the kind of publication we want to see, the kind of information we want to give out there? So what we've been doing, we've been encouraging most of our filmmaker, videographers, and also people that write blogs, who are the community themselves. So it's like we are just bringing back the power to the community when it comes to even translating the research information. So the KYC TV has been an opportunity for like to bridge data and information sharing when it comes to knowledge translation. Then another thing is how do we ensure that the political class also buy in the data that we use? One, we use using a data entry point for negotiation. So one of the way that we've been trying to like engage communities, just try understand the key priority needs, focus on that need, and also set it up to like fit in our projects. Then another thing is building long-term relationship, where we ensure that as much as we are building we are having a project, a research project, but we don't end up like, okay, it's a project, it has ended, so what next? So for us, what we normally do, we translate the project into a program, because a program doesn't have a timeline. So we try to see how do we shift from the research finding, what kind of program can work to support these initiatives. I can give an example of Nakuru County. Nakuru County is the third largest city in Kenya. So Nakuru County, there's a time we did vulnerability mapping in terms of understanding the climate change risk zones within Nakuru County. So Nakuru County is composed of 35 wards. So for Muungano na Vijiji and SDI Kenya, they supported when it comes to data collection. After collecting this data, it was an opportunity to also see, so how do we come up with intervention? So the first intervention was to like one, engage the county government through the director of environment to like develop ward committees like across the 35 wards in Nakuru. So the ward committees that were developed were aimed at supporting communities to like become more resilient to climate change effect and shocks. So from these the committees were also formed to target the financing locally led climate action, the FLOCA funds that are being given by the World Bank. So how do you ensure that also county utilize these resources? So that one was one of the way that Muungano took advantage as an opportunity for us to like bridge in that, as much as these committees will be formed, but we already have a data like that shows the risks that are involved. I think thank you. Yeah, and thank you. If there's any question, any addition,
Thank you.
Sarah.
Do we
Thank
still
you.
have
Yeah,
time?
thank you,
or
Jane.
have we
What I
exhausted?
might do is hold the questions, if that's okay for now. So move through the presentations and then we'll kind of have a collective discussion. I'm sure there will be many, many questions about all the fascinating things you've just highlighted. So if that's okay for now, I'm going to move to Pakistan and pass over to Dua Samir, who is a research associate and learning and impact coordinator at the Karachi Urban Lab, which is at the Institute of Business Administration in Pakistan. And she's been working on a British Academy funded project called Building Infrastructures of Climate Repair, which the OU was also part of. And working this year to turn the findings of that project into a repair manual for journalists and practitioners in Karachi. So Dua, I'll pass to you to talk about that experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Ari. That was a good segue. And thank you, Sarah and Jacob, for taking the lead on this conversation, because it actually really helps put into perspective a lot of what's happening on the Karachi end when we try and work with communities. So as Ari mentioned, we have been engaged with this British Academy project, which was titled Building Infrastructures of Climate Repair, since at least 2022. And so I'll give a brief overview of what it was, and then I'll move into, really talking about how we moved on our co-creation process. So the thematics that we were dealing with as part of the project, we were looking at how existing urban risks, which include, this housing crisis, um, that, like that makes it really, that's one of the like hardest like challenges in a city as big as Karachi. Um, yeah, and then how it, sorry, I'm kind of losing my words. Yeah, so we were looking at how existing urban risks in Karachi, which again include the unaffordable housing crisis, um, and then also like the inadequacy of our basic infrastructure services, and how they kind of are interacting with new climate risks to, result in these landscapes of vulnerability across different forms of informal settlements in Karachi. These include, what we know as Kachi Abadis here, and also new migrant settlements that are now being formed at the peripheries of the city, which house actually flood migrants, not just from 2022, but also 2010. So if and the kind of needs of repair that they are now springing forth, and that was the thematics that we were looking at. Um, I'll show a map of where these communities are. So as you can see, there's Sindabad and Tent City, which make up our tent settlements that house flood migrants from the rest of the province that move to Karachi. And then we have Kausar Niazi Colony, which is a long-established informal settlement that has seen a lot of housing evictions and also demolitions to make room for the widening of a natural water channel to curb urban flooding in the city. That has also resulted in a lot of, you know, just challenges related to, that what we call urban violence, right? In um, in the academic terms. Um, yeah, so that is an overview of what our situation was like and what kind of thematics and field sites we were pursuing. And as a result of about 4 years of working across these communities, I think the challenges that we were facing are very similar to what Sarah and Jacob were talking about. So when we were in the community, we were talking to people. The challenge was not that there is not community-based grounded work not being done, but the challenge was that there was a lack of technical training, a lack of literacy, and a subsequent, lack of documentation and research-backed data that community organizers and even journalists could then use to report on the situation, which was actually transpiring into this larger urban climate crisis, right? So as part of the grant that we have been working on for the last year, we have been able to produce this repair manual. It's an advocacy booklet. I'm calling it an advocacy booklet, which is essentially aimed to support the work of journalists and community workers and mobilizers and anyone who is on ground, who is shaping conversations and also taking action. Because what we find is that there is a disconnect, as Jacob was very like accurately talking about. Whatever data is collected as part of surveys and field work, it never sees the light of day in a manner that actually benefits the people who we speak to, who we work with, and that for us was just not cutting it. And especially in the kind of displacement context that we are speaking from, the need for advocacy, the need for justice-based writing, dissemination as much as possible, um, in very simple terms, is a way that Karachi Urban Lab, through this manual, has tried to approach our kind of intervention. So again, I have laid out what I have tried to do as part of the repair manual. We have tried to make our language and concepts simple but evocative. For example, we use this framework of the 24-hour rest city, which is essentially a sort of intersectional lens to look at how urban climate crises are really manifesting in our cities. And as in the repair manual, we also talk about, what something as vague as urban violence then translates in the context of our communities, The other idea was to contribute to popular debates. For example, when the floods in 2022 hit Pakistan, a very popular debate that arose as a result of it was whether the impacts are a result of our infrastructure failing, or is it just a natural disaster and we could have done nothing. And what we see year on year is that the answer lies somewhere in the middle. And when there is not enough information, when there is not enough readily accessible research-backed information, and also in the case of people who live in informal settlements who are then termed encroachers, and then have to suffer through housing demolitions. It's the fact that there is not enough work out there that can counteract those popular narratives that actually hamper how we are able to do post-disaster, reflections and take action. So what the manual really tries to do is it tries to contribute to those debates in a very bite-sized way, because also journalism now is very fast-paced, and also the advocacy work when it comes to the challenges in these contexts that we're talking about, it requires something that's easy to digest. And so that's what the manual does. And again, without going too much into it, it also satisfies the need for documented evidence. When you try to, at any sort of governmental level, do advocacy work, the challenge is always that there's not enough data. There is not enough research-backed, documented evidence of, what kind of crisis is actually resultant as in the aftermath of an extreme weather event such as an urban flood, or you know something that's more widespread. So there's that. And the last, and something that also I feel very personally like strong about, is that through the manual I really wanted to share community-backed solutions and community priorities. So that is something that does get missed out, right? When we look at the aftermath of an extreme weather event that then results into a disaster, what is missed out is um, those long-term human costs that displacement, um, actually has on communities that need to move across the province, across the country, to a new, alien, unfamiliar environment, where you're stripped of, any form of belonging. You were stripped of the type of work you were involved in. You were stripped of the kind of um, indigenous knowledge you might have had. For example, a lot of people who moved to Karachi were actually farmers who now have settled in the peripheries and either have to do daily wage work or resort to begging. Um, so when so it was very important for me to actually have very easily accessible, and also um, these struggles placed within like a larger structural framework um, of why these impacts continue to persist. And I'll run through some excerpts from the manual itself about how I've done it. So this is an illustrated manual um, because I think it's also really important to appeal to your readership. especially in Pakistan with a huge youth population that is also very actively engaged on social media. We, as researchers, I think we do need to like move to more innovative outputs that are easily digestible and actually help us reach max gains for the communities that we, collect data from, right? So I think for me, it's okay to admit that like, especially in Pakistan, um, it's not that community work isn't being done, that there is a real lack in terms of being able to document it and like produce it in a nice way that is um, actually that would actually be able to be disseminated. It's also okay to admit that as researchers there is a huge power gap in our context, and that as people sitting at a university, you know, a very well reputed one, we also have access to networks that can actually help disseminate these stories. So my aim with this manual was to actually make it so that the relevant people and readership, actually is attracted, and um, the manual appeals to them, right? And how it's laid out. And so we chose to do an illustrated manual. So going slightly back, when I spoke of how we've tried to really make our concepts evocative, um, this is the chapter in the manual where I actually do a little story narrative of how factors like the built environment, where you live, where you're located in the city, and what kind of gender occupation you might be involved in actually impacts um, the kind of risks you might face in these displacement contexts. So the first really has to do with the built environment. In these two panels, I talk about how the settlement itself is laid out, one in a more compound sort of way, and one in more solo tents, and the kind of risks that exposure to the environment, to the traffic around you actually brings. Then there are stories of how communities themselves try to navigate, risks that uh, I'm sorry, navigate like the kind of repair work that they are engaged in. This is on the right, you see a panel. It's a really inspiring story that we saw in our field, which is where these are migrants from Sindh who used to live in mud houses actually replicated that kind of housing arrangement in their new neighborhood in Karachi, and it kind of maps the challenges of maintaining that um, insecure but still better structure than a tent, which is usually just made of bamboo and then secured with, plastic panoflexes and rope, etc. So there's that. It has stories of how community-based organizations are actually working for the capacity building of the people that they work with. On the left, you see a panel, which is from Kosarnazi Colony, the settlement that's next to the water channel, which experiences urban flooding. And so this local CBO that we worked with actually taught the young boys of the community how to swim, so they could actually improve response times in case of actually as for children who had to drop out of schools post housing demolitions in the neighborhood. And I will actually have the girl who is the teacher in this remedial school with me next week to speak in our feedback seminar, which I'll talk a little about later. I close off the manual with some lessons.
Can I give you a couple of minutes of where we've got two presentations behind? Thank you.
Yeah. So I close off with lessons on what small-scale urban repair, the merits of it are, and then do a roundup of how we can actually support and finance this work across many scales. So I think that's where I will mostly end. This is essentially a path, a co-creation path that we followed as part of the project. We started off with a stakeholder workshop with our local CBOs and journalists. We engaged through them in the community. So we maintained those trust networks. And we are going to follow up with a feedback seminar next week where we present this repair manual to people from Caritas and also journalists and many policy professionals and researchers, so we can have a discussion across the aisles to really think about how we can synergize and work together in the future in a way that actually advances the cause of displaced people. And that's about it. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much, Dua. And hopefully the manual will get up digitally, as well as I know you're printing copies for colleagues in Karachi, and it will be in Urdu
Absolutely.
and in English, which is fantastic. We're going to move back to Nairobi and colleagues from Kuankui Design Initiative in Nairobi. And Shirley, I don't know if you're there to give us the final major talk about KDI's work. KDI is a non-profit design and community development organisation, works across the globe, but particularly in Kenya and Nairobi's informal settlements. And Shirley is a landscape architect with over 5 years' experience developing people-centric public spaces and transportation systems in Nairobi. And I'm delighted to welcome her as a colleague on a project we've called Sea Risk. I'm going to talk about the UK part of that project after Shirley's talked about the Kenyan part of that project. We've tried to understand the role of participatory methodologies in understanding climate change as a systemic risk, not just a one-off single event, single hazard risk that affects people's lives, but as something that's absolutely inbuilt into the systems around us in terms of both the causes and impacts of climate change. So Shirley, over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Ari, for the introduction and the wider OU for organizing this forum. Let me share my screen real quick. Everyone can see my screen?
Yeah, it's great.
Okay, thank you for that. For today, I'll be presenting on systemic co-inquiry, and in particular citizen science, systemic risk, and dense high-rise settlements in Nairobi. This is work that has been done by a team from KDI and also in collaboration with the community residents from 2 areas, high-rise areas in Nairobi. And all credit to my colleagues for the work I'll be sharing today. Ari, I think you've touched a bit on who we are as KDI. We are a non-profit organization that works with underserved communities. We started in Nairobi in 2006, and we are celebrating 20 years of working in underserved communities this year. And we not only work in Nairobi, but we work also within the region, and also in Stockholm, Sweden, and also in Los Angeles in the US and the Coachella Valley. We are a big team composed of designers, researchers, community organizers, gender experts, accountants, operations folks, and other community, also community staff also within our team. So today I'll be presenting one of our projects called the Sea Risk Project. It's a 1-year project that we are working collaboratively with the Open University UK and Talking Tree. And we're working in 2 areas in Nairobi, 2 residential areas in Nairobi, Pipeline area and Saika. We are drawing comparisons between these 2 areas. Our goal is to be able to understand how systemic risks are experienced, navigated, and reimagined by communities. And we're using a citizen science kind of approach where we are looking to understand these risks from a lived experience kind of perspective. And our focus is on qualitative data, not quantitative data, kind of a research approach. Our project is guided by 3 research questions. The first one being, how do personal histories and everyday experiences illuminate systemic risk? And how can participatory mapping and citizens' narratives reveal complexity and interconnectedness? And finally, how can this integration inform inclusive risk mitigation strategies? So those are the 3 research questions that are guiding our research process. As mentioned earlier, our research is based in 2 areas in Nairobi. One is called Pipeline and another one Saika. Pipeline is it's at a very advanced level in terms of vertical densification, and the majority of the buildings there are quite high rise, all the way to 12 floors. And a lot of risks are actually experienced as a result in Pipeline. Then in Saika, it's actually at the initial levels of densification with emerging vertical structures. And the reason why we selected the 2 is to be able to draw comparison between one area that is already at that level of vertical densification and another that is already is coming up, and drawing the parallels between the 2. And as mentioned earlier, also we are using residents as the experts. So the project really looks at residents as not as subjects, but as co-researchers. And we are working with residents from these 2 areas to co-produce the knowledge. And for this particular project, we onboarded 10 citizen scientists, so 5 from the Saika area and 5 from Pipeline, who we've been working with to bring out, rather to understand these risks and make them visible within these 2 areas. And before we could go any further with these 10 citizen scientists, we started by first aligning in terms of key ideas, such as the concept of risks, hazards, the concept of also systemic risk, and ensured that we sort of had a common way of co-production. So in terms of also tools that we were looking to use, the concept of autoethnography, and we wanted to ensure that first we have a convergence of knowledge systems before we could proceed with the research process. So yeah, basically we are using residents as experts, and they're the ones who collected all the data that I'll present in the consecutive slides. So these are the 10 citizen scientists with diverse backgrounds and experiences, some of whom were born and bred in these particular areas. Some were new entrants who are bringing new perspective. Some are also there's also diversity in terms of education background. Some have had a research background before, and some were totally starting out in terms of research. But all of them were bringing in different perspectives and understanding of risks in their areas. So what we were looking at is what we were looking to bring out in this research project was the concept of systemic risk. That risk is not an isolated concept. So we're not looking at just a blocked drain, for instance. We're looking at the whole systems that are attached to that particular. If it's a blocked drain, what is the systems relating to these blocked drains? So looking at, for instance, a blocked drain can cause flooding, can then affect transport system, can affect power. So we're looking at risk not only in isolation, but as a system, a whole system, and understanding how all these different risks in these 2 areas, how they interact and affect each other. and also looking at the coping mechanisms that the residents have also come up with to cope with these risks. So in terms of understanding the systemic nature of risks, we were looking at risks as cascading. So failure in one area triggering failure in other areas, more of a domino effect, like as shown in this diagram here. So one risk A affecting risk B and causing other risks to occur. And we're also looking at risk in terms of compounding, the compounding nature of risk. So multiple risks coming together and amplifying each other, as depicted to an extent in this diagram here. So the project took an autoethnographic methodology where we were putting risk in the context of community life, and the 10 citizen scientists sort of bringing out these risks from a lived experience kind of perspective. So they were documenting their everyday life, how they interact with these risks on a daily basis, how their neighbors interact with these risks. So to an extent, they were looking into their lives, but then they also got an opportunity to talk to the people close to them. We didn't really focus on interviews per se, but they were focusing on themselves and then like informal kind of conversations with the people around them. So for this, in our methodology, they were using 3 tools: journaling, so to capture what they were feeling at that particular time and capturing daily reflections. And then they were also using field notes to capture what they were seeing, and photo voices also to capture what they wanted to show. So they were sending us photographs, and we had a WhatsApp group for that purpose. So they were sending photographs, geolocated photographs in real time, capturing the various risks that they were trying to show. So these are some of the excerpts from the WhatsApp group, where they were sending in the risks that they were observing, the risks and hazards that they were observing on a real-time basis. So just to go back a little bit, for this particular project, we have two methodologies. So the first one is this autoethnography as a methodology, and the second one is participatory risk mapping. So once they collected the data, the field-based data collection, we had another layer where now they were trying to make sense of the data and synthesize what they had collected. And this was a process that we also undertook with the citizen scientists, and they were able to sort of now synthesize what they collected, and they were utilizing various methods. One of them was understanding risk on a spatial dimension, where they were mapping risks on maps, and also on drawings where they were showing also verticality of risk. And then the next one was also understanding vulnerability, where they were putting together the various personas that they interacted with, just to understand how different personas interacts with risk. And then they were also looking at the temporality of risk, where they mapped out a 24-hour scenario of risk. And then finally, they were now looking at the interactions of risks, how these different hazards that they've identified and risks, how they interact. So they were looking at cascading and compounding effects of risk. These are some of the photos of the session where they were trying to now synthesize what they collected collectively. This is a photo of the spatial mapping of hazards that they were undertaking, just showing the exact locations where they were able to identify some of the hazards and risks, and also pathways to show parts where certain risks occur. Then they were also using photo collages. So from the photo voices they had taken, they were extracting photos of the exact photos of the risks that they had collected and putting together as a collage, as a themed collages to help us also understand what they collected. Then they also were able to map risk, understand the verticality of risk, where they were able to map out what happens at different floors of the vertical structures in both pipeline and cycle. And they were detailing the various risks per floor. Then they were also able to map out risks by the clock. So what happens on a 24-hour basis and what happens throughout. So the outer circle mapping out the quarters on the outer circle, mapping out what happens at different times. And then the inner circle mapping out what happens throughout the 24 hours. So these were some of the risks that they were able to bring out. They had thematic areas of housing, urban forms and density, as well as also mapping out some of the risks that are associated with urban services. So there were some that were associated with the housing forms, population density in the areas, and some that also relates to the various urban services in these two areas. So these
Shelley,
are some of the persona cards.
Can I give you a couple of minutes just so we can open up for discussion? Is that okay?
Yes, thank you very much. So these are some of the persona cards that they developed just to be able to understand risk and the interactions that they were also able to put together. So we are now at a stage where we are working on our output, and we are putting together an exhibition actually happening tomorrow to take the outputs now to the community, and we'll have various community members interacting with what was collected, as well as also other people in practice, policymakers, local government, national government, and there's such a rich diversity in terms of the participants invited, and they're all going to be interacting with data and giving more and fleshing out more what was collected by the citizen scientists. We're also very soon going to be working on an analytical report as part of our output, and some policy papers as well. And this is just also to invite all of you for the exhibition tomorrow. Those will be able to make it. We'll have various zones at the exhibition. We'll have tours. We'll have a tri-citizen science activities. We'll have dialogues and reflections. And then we'll also have a call to action on how we proceed from the research. How do we proceed now to action from the research? Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Shirley. That's brilliant. And as you've highlighted, the kind of granularity, the really rich granularity that some of this research has generated, which was also a challenge, I think, for us as a research team, because we simply had such volumes of visual and written output, and how to synthesize that in the time of a kind of 1-year pilot project. I was going to do a brief presentation about the UK side, but I think I won't. I'll just say a few words, because the project that Shelley has presented also has a UK site in Runnymede in Surrey that I've been working on with Andrea Berardi, who's an OU colleague, and with the Talking Tree Climate Emergency Centre. And I think what's interesting, two things that are interesting to highlight from that accompanying experience, even though I won't go into it, we were very inspired by these methods of autoethnography and citizen science. It wasn't actually something we'd intended to do in Surrey. Don't worry about presentation though if it's too much PowerPoint by this point. But we did adapt that. And so it's been a real process of, I think, cross-learning from Nairobi into Surrey and around and back again. That's been really fascinating, and looking to the potential of kind of low-cost community-led solutions, even in the UK, where obviously kind of flood risk management and other environmental priorities have been hugely defunded over the last few years. And we found the governance of this in Surrey, also very top-down, very fragmented, and we found a lot of synergies even between Nairobi and Surrey in terms of the kind of governance structures that we were trying to influence and talk into. And we were also placed this emphasis on our participants as co-inquirers, and all their record-keeping practices. We went back over decades. This is a photo of the 2014 floods, which were the last major floods, Thames flooding in Surrey, and used people's logs, maps, online archives, Facebook groups as everyday data. And that is often what is deprioritized in formal risk assessment methodologies. And we're then looking at how this stacked up against kind of council framings of the problem and the kind of solutions that the council is proposing at the moment through adaptation and resilience policies. So again, we only had about 10 community representatives we were working with, so really not very many at all. It was a pilot, but they were very different from the kind of local wildlife, beaver, nature restoration person to a local community organizer, a kind of emergency response, to a long-standing resident who's been engaged in a citizens science project on these issues. So we had 10 very, very different people within that community, but the richness of the data that we were able to kind of draw up and we're taking to the council in July, but also deep political constraints across both the UK and Nairobi in trying to bring forth this kind of data. And even in the UK, the kind of extent of fatigue with extraction, with engaging with government policies where the Environment Agency no longer has the resource or capacity to act, and there are huge implementation gaps despite kind of promises of insurance and promises of flood maintenance, meant that a lot of our co-inquirers simply weren't willing to come to more stakeholder workshops with local or national government, to be honest. And at the same time that the local government feels that responsibilities often go beyond them. So engaging with citizens is a bit fruitless given their limited rooms to manoeuvre. So even in the UK, we thought we would get more political traction, I think, out of the work, but we've had quite an interesting time kind of trying to find space for it, although some success and the opportunity to present some of that work to the council. So that's my reflections from the UK piece, but I thought it was really important to keep some of that in there. We're going to kind of open the last bit to a more open discussion. I've asked a couple of colleagues if they would also bring in some of their reflections about the role of participatory methodologies in climate change research. We're joined by Moses Tatui, who should be here. He's an assistant professor at the University of Waterloo in Canada, who works on inclusive health systems, and he's currently coordinating a large UK Canadian Research Council project on health and climate change linkages in informal settlements. Moses, are you still there? He might not be, we might come back to him, but he's been instrumental. I've been very privileged to be part of that project that's in Zimbabwe, Uganda and Sierra Leone. We're looking at participatory action research, and I think trying to take it beyond, it's often assumed that kind of participatory action research is useful in a climate change context in kind of ground truthing the direct impacts of climate change on communities. But I think this is trying to push that frontier and move us like the systemic risk projects in saying, actually, we can illustrate far more complex cascading compounding effects from community perspectives, and that's really being ignored both in policy and in research, which has tended to kind of go for quantitative top-down modelling of those kind of effects of climate change and much less kind of draw up from community perspectives. But given, Moses is there. So Moses, I didn't know if you wanted to say anything from that project, just about the role of participatory methodologies and anything you've heard from today that resonates with both the opportunities and the challenges of trying to centre in this space.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Ari. And I just wanted to, underscore the similarities across the projects that the Kenyan team has presented, but also the Karachi team. I think there's one thing I want to underscore here, and that is the length of relationship that you have with communities that you work with. So I think the Kenyan team has demonstrated how they've worked for a very long time with these communities. I think that's important in how you begin to see things translate into change. Many times, some of the things that we grapple with is when we do participatory research, who is this participation for? And how is it real, and on whose terms this is happening, and how this is actually leading to some kind of changes in the end. What kind of change are we trying to get at? So right now in Uganda, we're working with the Uganda's Slum Resident Association that is working with Makerere University, and they've had a very long kind of relationship. We also have in Zimbabwe work with the informal workers association that is kind of working very closely to see how they are actively involved in framing the questions, in researching the problems, but also when we go into our next phase, how we begin to look at how we design adaptation strategies that might align with communities. Again, the other thing I want to underscore here is how these spaces are very political, deeply political spaces, both within the informal settlements, but also across different scales of cities with different actors. And as you can see in Kenya, they've been able to work very closely with different actors at different levels. And what I wanted to say here is different political systems provide different opportunities. In Kenya, as I'm very much aware, I'm from Uganda, Kenya is a much more has a much more devolved system, a much more decentralized system, and that presents, unique opportunities to be able to move things that communities are kind of bringing forward, which can look a bit different in places like Uganda. The power is still very much centralized, even though it's kind of, in principle, it's decentralized, but that is not how that works in practice. So you might find that being able to move voices beyond certain community voices or community solutions beyond certain levels can become difficult. And then you begin to see things where you have communities carrying heavy weights of solutions. So you have less responsibility put on political actors or structures that are continuing to perpetuate this kind of vulnerabilities across systems. So these are things that we're trying to grapple with within this project. We are right now still trying to understand the lived experiences of the different communities in these 3 different cities, in Kampala, in Sierra Leone, and Bulawayo. And then now we'll move into a phase where we work with different communities, with different stakeholders to try and look at how we might create adaptation strategies. But, the contexts are different and how things might move will look a little bit different. Yeah.
Thanks, Moses. That's really helpful. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pass back to Susan just to chair kind of wider discussion and question and answer. And then I've asked our colleague Les Levidow, who's here in the room with us in Milton Keynes, to make a few closing remarks. Les has worked for decades, I think, on participatory action research across all sorts of environmental issues. So I thought it'd be nice if you could close the seminar for us, maybe about 25 past, Susan. But I haven't got the chat open, and I'm hoping you have, Susan.
Yes, thanks so much, Ari, and thanks to all the presenters so far. That's been really illuminating and exciting research and practice that's been shared. I don't see any questions currently in the chat, but if people want to indicate their interest in coming in to ask a question or two, please do just use the raise hand function. All right, I see one here. I can't quite see who it is. Let me just go to the people. I think, is that Shreyasi Sharma? Would you like to come in?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Oh, great. Hi, everyone. Thank you. I'm really inspired by both Dua's and Shirley's presentation. And I just had a question for Shirley. So since it's directly tied to risk. So I just wanted to ask about risk. How did you get the citizen scientists to think about risk in a manner which is like, since risk is also very emotional and you're talking about qualitative work as well, how did you get them to talk about it in a very temporal or like spatial manner, or was it through a series of iterative workshops? How did that process happen? Thank you.
Right. Before I bring Shirley in, I'm just going to collect a few questions and then revert to those who've had questions asked from them before asking Les to close, if that's okay. I see a hand from Ari. Is that you or someone in the room, Harry?
It's not. I'm going to pass to Theo.
Yes, thanks very much. Yeah, very interesting research projects, really inspiring, I would say. I had a question about the first speaker on the repair manual. I mean, that sounds very interesting. Manual, so basically a roadmap for something, but I got the impression that it's overwhelmingly focused on infrastructure. I was wondering what can this repair? Is it about repairing, the infrastructure? What about the social relations which are broken as kind of very unequal relations between those living in those conditions and those who live in different conditions. I mean, I'm pointing this out, because recently I came across a work that two philosophers did, and they presented an argument about what would a city of equals look like, right? And I was actually wondering, what kind of repair might be leading, to some of these ideas, right? Because the city of equals is definitely a city that provides access to people to do things, despite the fact that they might have different resources. These people, right? So it establishes some kind of equal relations between the different communities. So that's one question. The other question is more methodological, because citizen science is a core element of what we call open research. And I was actually wondering whether you could say a little bit more about the methodology that you used. I mean, how you implemented citizen science. So, for example, how did you pick up the citizen scientists, for example? How did you make this choice?
Thank you. That's two really good questions. Are there any more questions or contributions from the floor? Otherwise, I'll go back to Shirley and Dua just to respond to those direct questions. Shirley, would you like to go first?
Yes, thank you very much for that question, Shama. So when we actually selected these citizen scientists, and also like the initial interaction with them, we could get a sense that most of them have gotten used to being in that environment, and they don't know what is actually a risk or a hazard and what is not. And so that's why we had an initial session, an initial workshop, where we introduced them to those terminologies and to help them identify what are hazards and the difference between hazards and risks. When does a hazard become a risk? So that initial session really helped them sort of be able to make visible what they already know, because we realized that they already know the risks in their areas, the hazards that they are exposed to on a daily basis. But now the question was like, how do they actually realize or be able to bring out and say this is actually a risk or a hazard? So we had that initial workshop with them, and then we had a WhatsApp group set up that they would send photos, also very quick notes on real time, and would be able to give them feedback immediately on what they were actually collecting, whether it actually, qualifies to be like the exact like risks or hazards. And since we were really focusing on vertically densified areas, also steering them back to what the research was about, without going into other risks or other areas, because the issues within these areas are diverse, some not really relating to the vertical dense settlement. So we were using the WhatsApp group, the initial workshop session that we had, onboarding session, but we also had weekly sessions with them on ground, where we would also guide them further on, if they had any challenges, if they needed, because also they reached a point of saturation with what they were collecting. And then they would ask us, what do we do? And then we'd be able to give them further guidance from there. About what you mentioned, the emotional nature of what they're encountering, yes, we experienced that quite a lot, because most of them were saying that they had not realized that they were exposed to such amount of risk in their areas, and also people within their areas were exposed to risks in that manner. In fact, some of them even witnessed somebody losing their life in the process. And we onboarded clinical psychologists to help them process the emotional toll that comes with processing these risks and bringing them out and and making them visible. So we had that mental wellness support to them from our end as well. I hope that answers your question to an extent.
Yeah, it does.
My
Thank you.
My colleagues are also on the call. They can come in to beef up my responses as they deem fit.
Okay.
Shirley, can you say a little bit about how you selected the citizen scientists? Because that was a big discussion, wasn't it, about how to select and their willingness to participate and to take, because they were basically taking on a job effectively.
Yes, so we're looking for people, a mix of people who've been either born and bred in the areas, but also we wanted a mix of new entrants who would offer a fresh perspective, because people who stayed there, born and bred, have gotten used to some of those risks and hazards. So we also wanted to have a mix. We're also looking for people above 18 years old who would be able to, of course, with a level of experience with technology and using a phone to be able to capture and also send us data in real time. We're also looking for, of course, someone who would be available for around 4 hours in a day to be able to carry out the research. Then we also did a mix of ages and academic levels, with different academic levels. So the lowest being a high school diploma, and then the highest being a master's graduate. So we also, so there was academic background, there was age as well. And then there was also geographical regions within the pipeline and Psycha areas. So mixing people from different areas in those two particular study areas was also a priority for us.
Great. Thank you so much, Shirley. Dua, would you like to come in?
Hi. Thank you for the question that was posed at me. Even though I missed the first chunk of the question, I suppose that the reflection was that my manual focuses a lot on infrastructural repair. And I think it would be valuable to think about, what a city of equals can look like. I really appreciate that question because I think it really highlighted a very central tension in the process of like developing this manual, which was really thinking about where does the responsibility lie when we're thinking of vulnerable communities. that are in very precarious, living in very precarious conditions, not just for months, but like decades in our fieldwork and our experience. Um, right? And what might it mean to, like imagine what equality and opportunity in a city can look like. So I think for us, it was very evident in, analyzing our qualitative findings that what's happening is at the center of everything. Um, when we talk about being able to like enact small scale urban repair, that's also like giving a net good to the community is that there is a cycle of poverty um, that is being reproduced in our context, right? When we think about new urban climate risks that communities are facing, which is so how I've approached the manual is, dividing my approach to, thinking about repair in short term, in the short term versus long term. So, and again, in my presentation, I mentioned somewhere that, I'm also like looking at this structurally. So, when we talk to people, what was very evident was that the level of repairs, the level of you know improvements you can enact was very, very directly tied to um, the kind of financial stability you had, which is actively being eroded with these new displacements that are happening as a result of new climate events, and also the kind of state policy that is actively, harming vulnerable populations that live in um, various mega cities across Pakistan and displacing them. So when I think about it in the short term, what we can do is then shift the burden from the communities um, in advocating for themselves, which is how the manual really came to be. But in the long term, I think what we need to advocate for is 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 just financial parity, access to opportunities that is led um, from the government, from stakeholders who have the financing to actually improve the quality of life for the many, right? So that is the tension that we were dealing with as we wrote this manual, right? That who are we placing the responsibility on? And I think my work with the manual was to highlight what the community priorities are, what the knowledge is that are present and actively being erased in these displacement contexts, how they can be centered to actually be highlighted and disseminated. Because what we find in Pakistan is that it's media narratives that are ill-informed that actually impose a sort of double disaster, right? So people that are actually vulnerable and being harmed are seen as encroachers that are the cause of very structural issues like urban flooding, that are actually decades long are a result of structural disadvantages that are imposed upon them through policy that doesn't give them affordable housing, that relegates them to living in very insecure settlements. So it is definitely a political conversation to that end. And I think I want to also reference something that Moses was um, talking about earlier, that it is absolutely like very, very much imperative to like think about what the governance system, looks like in each context. From being in Nairobi, I do know that it's more devolved. Karachi, a city of 20.3 million, and that is an undercounted figure from 2023, right? The city that is the size of a small country does not have a devolved local government that can actually like enact these um, you know um, repair initiatives, and is actively like ignoring them, right? This crisis that is forming at our peripheries year on year, with more floods, more both urban and rural. So yeah, I think it's a larger conversation, and I think we need to think about it both structurally, and then in like more grounded ways, and also like in more short-term ways where we can actively like help the communities, versus long-term where we advocate for policy changes, we advocate for better financing, we actually advocate for better local governance setups that will facilitate vulnerable communities. So that's my answer. I hope that helped.
Thanks so much, Dua. Before I hand over to Les Levedale for the final sort of contribution, I just want to say a massive thank you to all the speakers here and everyone that's participated, and to Ari for organising this very insightful session. I also want to let you know about the next seminar in the series, which will be the final one for this year, which is on Wednesday, the 13th of May. And that's with Stina Hackinson from the Copenhagen Business School. And she'll be presenting her work on transition-driven windows of opportunity, the role of China. So do look out for that and come along. I'm going to hand over now to Les Levedale, and it's a sort of bittersweet moment because I understand that this is sort of formally Les's final seminar, although I'm sure we'll see you again as he retires. And I just want to thank Les for being such a brilliant and supportive member of the academic and research community of the OU. He's been, probably the most regular participant and possibly most active participant of these seminars. And I have never been in a session where, regardless of any kind of topic and who's speaking, where Les has not asked a question and that question has been deeply engaged and insightful. So thank you for your time, engagement and generosity in that, Les. And now the floor is yours to make your final remarks on this session.
Hey, thanks for those comments. This won't be my final seminar, and I will be doing more webinars of my own or our own, including the Research Festival on 3rd of June with my Brazilian colleagues. So, given the short time here, I'll just pose some questions for further exploration, questions that would be relevant to community-based research or community-driven solutions anywhere. So one is, when we say this does research with communities or with a community, the with can have many meanings, and likewise the community. And from my knowledge and experience, a successful project always deepens or changes the meaning of community. It extends community bonds, partly through the greater capacities to do research on themselves and on the wider socio-political forces that are blocking or hopefully facilitating, but especially those blocking the community-driven solutions, which necessitates the research and the information of a different kind that comes from the dominant system. So that's a question of how does the research, or should it, transform the community bonds that define what is the community, and that leads to the concept, say, community resilience in a climate chaos context. It could be called climate resilience, but with that subject in mind, the collective subject gaining climate resilience. Now, stereotypically, the term has meant the capacity to respond to disruption by bouncing back. However, there's an alternative meaning, namely bouncing forwards. And this came from analyses of community-driven initiatives in the tsunami in Southeast Asia 2 decades ago. And that concept, bouncing forwards, has been increasingly taken up. And of course, it relates to transforming the community into a collective subject that gains the power to implement its own solutions. So it's not to the status quo ante, it's to a different, better future, which can't be known until that collective inquiry is done. And then another concept here is the data collection, say, on flood problems. Yeah, it's fascinating because after the floods in Pakistan, that came up in many webinars that I attended, global webinars. And the speakers from Pakistan, not necessarily the environmental NGOs in the West, but the ones from Pakistan, emphasized the point you're making, that the natural disaster disguised the problem. And that was a strategic disguise. And even some environmentalist groups colluded in that by saying, well, it wasn't natural, it was greenhouse gas emissions globally. But that also disguised the global but locally specific problem of land financialization, capitalization, whatever we call it, which by various means eliminated the floodplains, which thereby guaranteed massive flooding problems. We have the same problem in this country, right? Yeah. With the same kind of necessary debate, which almost isn't happening. Land financialization is the problem. And that leads to the next question. Well, then what kind of data collection is necessary to identify the drivers of the land financialization, which then can lead to a solution? And that's about political power. So data collection, what would that mean? And then the final point I'll say here about autoethnography. I mean, I've got much more involved in that through an initiative of the Palestine Solidarity Group at the university. We did such a survey of writing autoethnographic accounts of people's experiences of the Palestine exception. And then we've analyzed those results, sent it to a journal, and then in that piece, we raised the question, what would it be like to do a collective autoethnography? And perhaps that's what you've done, but that would be an important contribution to describe by what methods did you structure a collective process of autoethnography. So I'll stop there for brevity.
Thank you, Les. Giving us more food for thought, I think, as we go on with that project. Thank you.
Yeah, by the way, I mean, the university.
Susan,
So,
I'll hand to you to close.
All right, then I was going to ask if you wanted to close, but I'll formally close this then. And thanks everyone once again. And we'll see you on the 13th of May for the next seminar. Thank you all.